Thank you, Islan, for joining us for this interview.
Thank you for inviting me.
Okay, now let's cut right to it. Can you explain exactly what an exchange-traded fund is and how exactly does it work?
Okay, an exchange-traded fund or an ETF, in terms of feature, is very similar to a unit trust, except that it is listed on a stock exchange. For investor to subscribe to unit trust or transact in unit trust, they would go through agents typically. But in the case of an ETF, they would transact through the stock exchange, just like an ordinary stock. And in terms of objective, an ETF aims to track or perhaps replicate the performance of an index, or what we'll call a benchmark index. The benchmark index can be any type of index. It can be equity-based, it can be fixed income-based, or a combination of both. But in the end, the objective is really to try to achieve the same performance as that of the benchmark index.
So how exactly does an ETF track an index?
Okay, let's take an equity ETF as an example for this discussion. In the case of an equity ETF, there would be component stocks in the index. The ETF would actually invest in these component stocks in the same weight as the index in order to achieve or try to achieve the same level of performance. So this is what we call tracking. And the performance of an ETF is measured largely by the tracking error, which is the difference between the performance of the index against the performance of the ETF itself. And the lower the tracking error, the better is the ETF generally from a performance perspective. So when the index is rebalanced, which typically is on a quarterly basis, what we may find is the ETF fund manager will also rebalance the fund, the ETF, so that the weightings are always matching with the index in order to keep the tracking error as low as possible.
So why would an investor want to invest in an ETF as opposed to, say, a conventional stock or unit trust?
Okay. First, perhaps I'll compare an ETF to a stock. I think the primary difference is the convenience and also the diversification. For example, an investor who buys a single stock, they will have exposure to one stock. If they want to have exposure to a diversified range of stocks, they would have to do, say, 10, 20 transactions, depending on the number of stocks that they prefer to hold. In the case of an equity ETF, that ETF already comprises a basket of portfolios or basket of stocks. Yeah. So in this case, by doing one transaction, buying an ETF unit is the convenience of not having to do multiple transactions and also achieving diversification in one single transaction. What it also means is that it is a cost-effective way for an investor who wishes to diversify, because if they do, say, 10 or 20 different stock transactions to buy individual stocks, they will incur 10 or 20 different transaction charges. Whereas in the case of an ETF, you just incur the transaction charges just once, and you have exposure to a diversified basket of stocks.
And what about against unit trusts?
Okay, against unit trusts, there are a few differences, a few benefits, I would say, of investing in an ETF. One is, again, in terms of cost. The transaction cost for an ETF is the same like buying a stock. So basically, you pay brokerage commission, and then there's stamp duty and clearing fee. All this should amount to less than 1% of the transaction value. Whereas in an actively managed unit trust, the typical front end or sales charge, which will be charged to the investor, is on average between 4 and 6%. So there is already on day one a substantial differential in terms of the cost to the investor. So that is one benefit of going through an ETF as opposed to a unit trust. Another benefit is what I would call the transparency. Because an ETF tracks an index, investors know what are the components of the ETF. which are basically the same as the components of the index. So for an investor, before they even buy an ETF or units in the ETF, they would know what they're investing their money into, which is good investment concept, I would say. However, in a unit trust, an investor basically relies on the track record of the unit trust manager. He or she does not really have access to what stocks are held in the fund or in the unit trust fund, except maybe on a semi-annual basis when the results are announced, when the semi-annual report on the fund is released. And even then, that the information is historical and a snapshot information. So there is less transparency in a unit trust compared to an ETF.